US Chess Championship started in St. Louis featuring all the best American grandmasters including Fabiano Caruana, Wesley So, Levon Aronian, and the one and only Hans Niemann in the open section, and the likes of Alice Lee, Jennifer Yee, Irina Crash in the women's section. Just minutes before I started making this video, devastating news came about. Daniel Naroditsky, famous American grandmaster, beloved chess commentator, one of the best in the world, and just a great ambassador of the game of chess. Great person, passed away at the age of 29. Shocking news. My condolences to his family and to the whole chess community. So on this somber note, we're gonna analyze the best games of day 7 of US Championship and the most important game of the day and possibly of the tournament, Hans Niemann against Fabiano Caruana. Both grandmasters had 4 points out of 6, so this game was very important from all different angles, and let's see what happened. Niemann started with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. The most popular continuations here for black are bishop c5, which leads to Giocopiana opening, and knight f6, two knights opening, but Fabiano Caruana played d6. And it probably shocked his opponent, because that's not the most popular move in this position. c3, preparing strike in the center, d4, and immediately f5 from Caruana, opening the position. d3, queen f6. Very interesting continuation from Fabiano, very interesting opening choice, I would say. Castle for Niemann. Computer doesn't like it immediately because it basically puts the king in danger of an immediate attack from black, and black plays the best move in the position, f4. b4, starting some activity on the queen side of the board for Niemann. Caruana develops his knight, a4 for Niemann, and g5 for Caruana. He basically starts pawn avalanche on the white position on the king side, and there is no safety for white's king. b5 attacking the knight, knight goes back to d8, d4 striking in the center, but g4 attacking white knight. Knight e1, h5, and look at those pawns. They're just marching forward, and white's position starting to look very, very problematic. Niemann plays knight a3. The problem here is that white are playing on the left side of the board, on the queen side of the board, where all the action is really on the right side of the board, on the king side of the board. Knight e6, another piece is joining the attack for Caruana. b6 for Niemann, very nice sacrifice of the pawn, because that move gives the b5 square to the knight, and that's actually more important than the pawn in this position. Fabiano Caruana totally realizes that and plays the best move again, c6. He doesn't allow white pieces to get to a square b5. He doesn't care about the pawn on b6. Bishop goes back to a2 and knight g5. Not just attacking the pawn on e4, but just getting another piece in to join the attack on the king. Knight d3. Here it turns out that taking the pawn on e4 is not that good, because the king is in the middle of the board for black, and that will just open the e-file for white's rook. Knight g6. Another knight is joining the action. Knight c4, and again, the problem here for white is that they're playing on the wrong side of the board. Bishop e6, bishop a3, attacking the pawn on d6, but it's too late. Bishop takes c4, bishop c4, and f3, immediately trying to crush white's pawn structure, this white fortress, to break it and attack white's king. g3 is logical reply here, but white squares, light squares around the white king are becoming very, very
poor. h4, immediately starting the march of the pawn h-pawn and trying to open h file for the rook. All makes sense. Queen c2. Now Caruana just takes the pawn on b6, rook e1, and rook d8. And the rook is getting rerouted to h file. Niemann plays d5, rook d7, all according to the plan. The rook is going to h7, exchange of the pawns on c6, and bishop c1. Here you can take the pawn on g3. It doesn't really matter much. Black still has a totally winning position. It's actually quite unusual on this level that after move 24, and actually already 2-3 moves before that on move 20, one of grandmasters playing black, actually, as a matter of fact, has such a dominant winning position. But that's exactly what happened in this game. Rook h7, and just look at this position. Both rooks, both knights, and a queen, and all these pawns are looking at the white king, attacking it, and all white pieces are basically standing on the queen side of the board, too far away from where the action takes place. Bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, queen b3. White's idea is to take the pawn on b6, then possibly on c6 with a check, and then a pawn is very dangerous and could become a queen. Could become queen very, very soon, but white is too late. Caruana takes the pawn on g3, queen takes b6, and queen h4, a quiet move. And now it turns out that there is simply no defense from queen takes h2 checkmate. Or if pawn takes pawn, then queen could checkmate from h2, from h1, and there is simply no defense. Yes, white can still check their opponent, and that's exactly what Niemann does. He checks from b8, king e7, and Niemann resigned in this position. Yes, he can do another check from queen c7, let's say, but king would simply go to f6. Could be another check here, queen d8, but after bishop e7, game over. Queen is under attack and no checks, and there is a checkmate with the next move. Absolutely brilliant win by Fabiano Caruana, the game that Hans Niemann cannot be happy about, obviously, playing white against his main rival in the tournament and basically getting crushed. After this win, Caruana becomes a leader in the open section. Let's take a look at the standings. After round 7, Caruana and Wesley So, two favorites before the tournament started, are leading with 5 points out of 7. Levon Aronian and Hans Niemann are a point behind with 4 points out of 7. Another game I want to show you today is in the women's section. Atusa Pourkashiyan against Alice Lee, one of the favorites of the tournament and the leader of the tournament, 16-year-old Alice Lee. Atusa is an American grandmaster, and she is the wife of none other than Hikaru Nakamura. And she starts the game with e4. We have Sicilian defense c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, exchange of the pawns, knight f6 hitting the pawn on e4, knight c3 protecting it, d6, normal developing moves, bishop e2, and e5. Attacking the knight simply goes back to f3, bishop e7, castle, castle, then bishop g5, and after bishop e6, all the minor pieces are developed. The developing stage of the game is over, and now Atusa takes the knight on f6 to have control of the square d5. And her knight immediately jumps to d5, looks really strong there, and Alice just takes it with the bishop. Queen takes d5, and this position is slightly better for white because black has a pawn on d6, which is very, very weak. It has to be protected at all times, but Alice shows why she is so great in chess and plays queen b6. She doesn't even care about the pawn on d6. It's too passive to just starting defending it, and it's much better to have counterattack. And she counterattacks the pawn on b2. And Atusa doesn't take the pawn on d6, therefore, but protects the pawn on b2, offering exchange of the queens. Alice doesn't oblige. She plays queen c7, c3, not allowing any black pieces to get to a square d4, mainly a knight, g3, rook d1, rooks belong on open files, rook c8, same for black, rook e1, king g7, and knight d2. And the idea here is to put the knight on c4 and attack the pawn on d6 with both the knight and the rook. Therefore, understanding that threat, Alice plays knight a5. Not just attack the queen, but most importantly, to take control of the square c4. Queen d5, bishop g5. That move doesn't make sense at the first glance, but after b4, basically we know why that move was played, because the idea for Alice was to exchange her bishop, which is not a great bishop, by the way, because it's kind of surrounded by the pawns of the same color. She takes the knight on d2, rook takes d2, and now puts the knight on c4. And we have more exchanges. After all these exchanges, this is the position on the board. We have 2 rooks against 2 rooks, 7 pawns against 7 pawns. The pawn on d6 is weak, the pawn on c3 is weak, and the position is seemingly absolutely Jovish. How do you win this position for either color is a big question, but one of the players showed us how. Rook d8, protecting the pawn. King f1, king f6. The kings are marching towards the center of the board, which is very normal for endgames. That's where the kings should go. King e6 and rook b5. Pawn on b7 is under attack, so b6 is logical. a4, rook c6, a5, offering the exchange of the pawns, but Alice plays on the other side of the board with the move f5. And after exchange of the pawns and taking it with the king, rook d3, we have king e6, rook d2, and d5. So in the last 6-7 moves, black achieved something, and that something is 2 connected pawns in the center of the board. So black is now controlling the center, which is important, and their position is slightly better. Exchange of the pawns on b6 and rook a2. White's rook is going to 7th rank, but Alice doesn't really care about this, and she continues marching forward with her pawns with the move e4. Rook a7. And here kind of important point of the game, because the pawn on h7 is under attack. Rook d7 doesn't work because rook will take on d7, king will take on d7, and rook will take a pawn on d5 with the check. So that move doesn't work either. And seemingly white's position is good. But Alice sees deeper. She takes the pawn on c3, rook takes b6 check, king e5, and in this position, it turns out that white cannot take the pawn on h7. That would give them some advantage, an extra pawn, but if rook takes h7, black wins on the spot. Rook c2 check, king d1, and a rook d on c8. And it turns out that white king is trapped, and it's gonna be checkmated pretty soon. So let's make any move. For example, check with the rook, king d4, let's say b5, and then simply there is a checkmate. There is a checkmate that cannot be avoided without losing a rook for white. So therefore, rook takes h7 is not an option for white. And I don't know if that was something that Atusa didn't see in the calculations. So she had to remove her rook to a2 and survive at least the checkmate ideas. king goes to d4, check, king c4, rook b7. Another rook is trying to attack the pawn on h7. Let's make sure that here the position is still pretty even. King b3, rook takes h7. That was pretty greedy. Yes, white has an extra pawn, but after d4, those central pawns are becoming very dangerous. Rook e7, second mistake in a row by Atusa, and that's really a decisive mistake because after rook e7, black's position is totally winning, starting with the move d3 check. King goes to e1, rook c1 check, rook d1, and a rook c8. And white are really without any good moves. Atusa played a rook a7. Let's take a look what would happen if she would have taken the pawn on e4, which seems logical because the pawn is not protected and white has two extra pawns. The winning move for black is king c2 in this position. King c2, and let's say after exchange of the rooks, white cannot do anything to protect themselves from this pawn d going forward and becoming a queen. So therefore, taking on e4 was not an option. Let's just take a look at one more quick variation. Rook takes e4, king c2, and rook d2. If there was a move rook d2 check, then white didn't have any problems. But the rook is pinned, so rook d2 check is not possible in this position, and that's why black just wins quickly. Atusa saw that and played the move rook a7. Alice continued with rook c2. Again, white do not even have a check here in this position. Rook takes c1 and d2, final nail in the coffin. This is really nice stuff. What an endgame by Alice Lee. After d2 check, the next move would be to take the rook and with making it a queen, and black wins. Let's take a look at the standings in the women's section. Alice Lee, who just turned 16 during this tournament, is leading with 5 points out of 7. Anna Zatonskih and Anna Sargsyan are trailing by half a point, and 5 players have 4 points out of 6. Hope you enjoyed the games I showed you today. Like and subscription would be greatly appreciated, and thank you for watching.